Thank you, Gina. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here speaking to TBA members, one of the shareholders and members of the British Horse Racing Authority. It's good to have the chance to discuss a few things with you. And what I'd like to do for about 20 minutes, and then leave open to some questions, is just to talk a bit about state of the nation, the BHA's role and responsibilities, and specifically our objectives during 2019, and then talk about some areas where we're cooperating with the TBA and its members, and some of the challenges that we face. And I'd welcome questions on anything at the end. I thought I might start with a few observations from 2018. There's been a lot of talk today. I think the phrase rubbish was used about prize money in Britain. We know that obviously in Britain our prize money compares unfavorably with some of the countries we compete with, but there was record prize money in 2018, £160 million, which was £70 million more than in 2011. So a significant progress over those years as a result of improving media rights, the work of my colleague Richard Wayman and his team in terms of making sure that racecourses put in additional funding to receive and unlock the funding that they need, and of course a return to pre-digital betting levels of the levy, which bounced from around about 45 million to north of 90 million in its first year. So all of that helped contribute to prize money. An emphasis was put not only on looking after the top end, but considering the returns to owners at the middle and lower ends of the sport as well, where we were seeing seepage and loss of owners. Betting activity was up around 2%, and that goes against the expectations of anywhere else around the world in terms of major racing jurisdictions. It's a trend that has been in place for about 3 years, according to official Gambling Commission figures, and it's a positive sign. We sometimes say that our sport is struggling for relevance among modern bettors, and we should never take it for granted. But actually, the work that was done in achieving levy change and looking at what we call the Authorised Betting Partners project 2 or 3 years ago proved that British betting operators know that they make more money from people who bet on British racing than from those who do not. So our product, in its widest sense, remains very important to them. Field sizes have improved in 2018. We made a real effort on cracking down on unnecessary non-runners, treading the line between ensuring that we manage transparency with at the same time ensuring welfare and not wanting to put that in jeopardy. And also I think the race program improved in the widest sense to try and match the opportunities a bit better for individual runners. So we had an improvement overall, which is important for the funding of our sport. Horses in training with owners increased, and ownerships and syndicates are helping to, the declining trends in those areas are being reversed at the moment, although it's fragile, as I'll come to. The trend regarding the proportion of ownerships in fewer hands continued. Polarization's continuing, and our sport, as we've touched on a little bit this morning, in other parts of the seminar, has realized that it continues to have a battle on its hands. If we're to lose one of our major 4 investors in racing in this country, that will leave a significant hole, and we are much weaker than many, many other racing nations in that regard, perhaps with the exception of Ireland. The report that the TBA commissioned on British breeding continues to show structural weakness, and it juxtaposes the position of those who are involved in breeding in this country versus their international competitors. We are at a disadvantage, and it's an area that we need to work on, and I'll talk a little bit about Brexit, but Brexit offers some potential opportunities in terms of working together to ensure the right outcomes for British breeders. British racing needs strong British breeding. It's no longer a case of standing by and saying they're separate parts of the same industry. It's vital that we have a stronger breeding backbone for the future of our sport here. There's limited evidence of consumer growth in terms of who's interested in our sport. I think Peter mentioned earlier there are 6 million people who come racing. That's the total attendance. In terms of those who the individuals who come along, it's about 2.7 million adults come racing across the year, and the vast majority of those come racing less than once a year. And they may come racing for all sorts of reasons, which are nothing to do with why we are involved in this sport. There is no, unfortunately, along with that at the moment, I have to tell you that there is no agreed industry vision and strategy in place for our sport. I've been here for 4.5 years, been reminded regularly that the BHA has no commercial role. Often tried to be put back in our place, if you like, whenever we try to bring strategic move forward. But right now, I think the industry has a burning platform to help ensure that we do have a strategy, a joined-up strategy for our sport, and I'll come to that in a little while. Over last year, there was increasing public and parliamentary concern about equine welfare and the outcomes with regard to welfare concerns in our sport, which culminated in a Westminster Hall debate, which is a debate sparked by a petition in October 2018. And in that, some notable MPs, including those on the government side, said that the fatalities on race days in British racing needed to continue to improve, despite the fact that we have improved. The long-term trend is downwards and continued to go downwards up until this point, with an expectation from some MPs that there should be no fatalities on a British racecourse. Well, of course, we could deliver him that, but that would involve the end of British racing. So we're working hard on ensuring that government understands avoiding reasonable risk, and it's that concept that we're trying to get into the heads of parliamentarians so that they can stand by our sport as they wish to, but still feel that they can speak about it to those who are perhaps in the modern world changing their opinions about the use of animals in sport. So going into 2019, these were the BHA's priorities. And on the right-hand side were our notes at the time, in case you think any of them are strange or out of date now. And I'll refer to some of them as we go. We had a changing board in 2018 into 19, and some shareholder disruption about what the role of the BHA should be. It meant that we had a series of priorities that we as an executive team felt we should pursue, but also others were seeking to ask the BHA to take certain work forward. Accordingly, whilst I would have liked 5 or 6 key priorities, we ended up with a lot more, as you can see on there, as you can hopefully see on there. But looking at Tier 1, our biggest priorities, agreeing a new welfare strategy for equine welfare and ensuring the sport could come across it. The BHA has responsibility technically only for welfare from the point a horse enters training to the point it leaves training. The public doesn't really care what the BHA has got responsibility for. It cares about what British racing is doing on welfare. And therefore, what happens before racing and after racing is equally important. David Sykes, my colleague, is going to take you through the headlines around the direction we're going with that and news of the new welfare board. Industry people, how do we make sure that we can create the right conditions to recruit, retain, and look after our people well so that we have a healthy workforce fit for purpose for British racing. Campaigning for levy extension already, although the levy is coming in at much better levels than before the levy reform. We're seeking to reform it again. Why? Because we're seeing trends that indicate that that the gross win model can be gamed by betting companies, and we don't get our fair share. And also in a post-Brexit world, one of the key things we're seeking to do is to ensure, like other countries, we receive payment for bets made by British consumers on racing overseas. So if you're in Ireland or if you're in France and you're the racing authority there or the government there, you do receive payments on British racing. And it's not a secret to say that in betting terms, more money is made for Irish racing by the racing we put on here in Britain than is earned by their own racing. And we would just like to see a level playing field, which would mean that we can earn some money on foreign racing, and that would add something like 30 million to central funding. Governance and stakeholder engagement. The BHA, as Anna-Marie Phelps, our new chair, said the other day, needs to be collaborative to its core. And that needs a bit of resetting with our shareholders. You as a shareholder and the other shareholders in the sport, we need to have a stronger collaboration and a better model for consulting with the various parts of the sport. I think under my own leadership, we've consulted a lot. The issue is we've consulted on things that are our own decision, and too often, for good reason, we've come to people and said, what do you think about this? And then they get a little bit upset because we haven't managed their expectations in saying, well, we wanted your opinion, but this is not a formal consultation with you. We need to differentiate far more between what we're consulting on formally and where we're simply asking for individuals' help given their experience and background. Racing administration, Weatherby's has been a stalwart, a backbone of our industry for, crikey, I think it's 250 years, something like that. But like with any organization, we constantly look at the service that we're providing to all of our stakeholders, the digital access, how you are being served, how difficult is it to get basic things done, and what should a modern racing interface look like for all those involved in the sport. We're looking at how we move that on together with Weatherby's, but likely to involve a fresh injection of technology capability. We talked about ownership and how we get people involved in owning horses. At the moment, even if you take that example, it's quite complex, as many of you will know, to get through all of the hurdles that we need to get through to ensure that we can deliver new ownership quickly and seamlessly. That's a lot to do with the BHA's rules, and it's a bit to do with technology, and we're working on both to help deliver a modern experience. Safeguarding. I was at a meeting a few months ago where leading industry practitioners said, Nick, you talk about safeguarding, you talk about these areas, you need to focus on racing more, and you need to focus on getting us more staff. Well, safeguarding, unfortunately, British racing is no different to the rest of society. It's no different to the BBC. It's no different to local government. It's no different to schools. We have young, vulnerable people who are exposed potentially to issues which they shouldn't be exposed to, and where we as a sport need to ensure that we're across it. We rely on government investment and support for our industry. There is a code of practice issued in 2016 under Tracy Crouch's leadership as sports minister, which said, here is what sports need to do to ensure that they get funding from government or government-related bodies such as Sport England. Whilst we don't directly receive funding from that source, we do require government support, and it's simply not an option for us as a sport to say, well, we can worry about that another day. So we have launched a policy, and we now have some resources, and the BHA is able to look at that area of our industry. In the second tier, I'll come back to this in a minute, there's a project called Racing Futures, which looks at the strategy for our sport. I'll touch on that in a bit. Stewarding, this was controversy-free in 2017 when the BHA announced that it was going to make changes to stewarding. We're now implementing those changes at the moment. I think this ship is turning slowly in the right direction. We're about to appoint a new chief steward or head of stewarding, which will make a big difference to help ensure that there is consistency and a steadying of the ship. Our stewarding has been a good pillar of British racing, but it's not as modern and as proactive as it needs to be, and we need to keep driving it forwards. BHA people, of course, we must look after our people. We had a bit of a battering in the BHA over the last year. It seemed to be fair game for a few months simply to have a go at anyone inside the BHA. I read with interest, and I was delighted to see that a number of people have come forward through the Racing Post, Roderick Duncan being one of them, talking about the experience he has as a clerk of the course, not BHA executive, but a clerk of the course and someone who has to face constant haranguing, challenge, pretty difficult behavior. And it's led to a proper discussion on the back of the mental health report in our sport about where we need to go with things. And, the BHA isn't so far away from that. I read Roderick Duncan's comments and thought, crikey, in February and March, I felt a bit like that myself, equine flu, an ex-footballer, an ex-teacher, and someone from an established family saying I wasn't fit for the job publicly, and that being discussed everywhere. It's bound to have some sort of an impact. They might be right, but the point is having that discussed and having that constant challenge in our sport where it's fair game to do those things. The BHA's people and team are there working pretty hard. They do understand horse racing. They have limited resources, and they're doing their very best to uphold all of the demands in this sport, and we have to look after them. We have to want to make sure that people will want to come and work for the BHA, so that's key. Brexit will cover. Diversity, the Women in Racing report in 2018 published, led to the setting up of the Diversity in Racing group. We made our first appointment with Rose Griselle as the head of diversity and inclusion for the sport, and some plans are coming into practice now, particularly around female riders, I'm pleased to say, but also some progress, as you may have seen recently, with a good alliance with Stonewall and raising the awareness around those of different sexualities within the sport, and saying that they are as welcome as the rest of those who are from a traditional, if you like, heterosexual background. We've completed a racecourse licensing review, was long overdue. It firms up on requirements and aligns them to the needs of British racing and the reputation of racing. The review's complete, and the new licenses will be issued or not at the end of 2019. Fixtures and funding, I wrote here, can be done with business as usual activity. Well, when we wrote that in October, that was right. Then there was some activity and some boycotting taking place in February and March, so it's taken up quite a bit of our time. But the idea is to continue to evolve that fixture list in line with the needs of the sport, across the sport. Buying and selling of racehorses review, which I'll talk about shortly. And then finally, a rewriting of the rules of British racing, preserving the intentions of those rules, but making them accessible, searchable in a digital format and laid out in a way that helps people understand. One of the best things I think about the rules of racing is that those who are licensed or come under the rules of racing, the first rule is that they need to know the rules of racing. And it always makes me smile when I see in the stewards' rooms this big book that they have to refer to. So we don't know the rules off by heart. We don't expect everyone in racing to completely know them off by heart, so we want to make it more accessible. What's happened in 19? Well, we've seen some change. I referred to some of it. The expected impact of betting shop closures is already impacting on prize money. Why? ARC and some other companies, racecourse operators, decided to cut prize money. ARC was the most visible one because they came out early in January and said that they would cut prize money as a result of a fall in expected income. That did lead to a bit of an uprising amongst horsemen, trainers in particular, leading trainers, who organised boycotts in February and March, and I'll return to that shortly. We had another blow in that levy income suffered a £15 million fall in the final quarter of 18-19, led by a poor Cheltenham and, frankly, a high proportion of winning favourites on consistent ground in February and March as well. I'm pleased to say that the run rate looks as if the £15 million is indeed a blip, but nevertheless, that's had an impact on our expenditure expectations for the rest of the year. Brexit uncertainty continues, I think it's fair to say. We had equine flu in February with racing stopping for a week. Obviously a tough time for all involved. The BHA was particularly conscious to listen to its veterinary committee on this, and given where the outbreaks were happening, not just Donald McCain, but some other significant outbreaks in non-thoroughbreds in this area of Newmarket, given it was foaling time, breeding time, we were very keen to ensure we took no risks with that, and of course, with the Cheltenham Festival approaching as well. Polarisation at sales continues. The top end's doing well, the bottom end's struggling. Such is the way of life, but it's accelerating with all the data that we see. And whilst there were some better results over the last 9 months, we're still seeing that effect happening. There is some uncertainty around major investors in bloodstock and racing, and we're too exposed to it, I would argue. And the government's animal welfare minister, the first one the government's had, continues to push for racing to modernise and improve its welfare, and particularly race day fatalities, as I mentioned. On the other hand, on the consumer front, ITV racing audience figures continue to improve, which is good news. Betting on racing continues to grow. And we've had some positive national stories around Cheltenham, Aintree, female riders, British breeding success as well. There has been some good headlines around in 19. I think it's a time to come together. It's often talked about. I talked about it when I first joined the role in 2015. People do talk about it a lot. We've had a period of relative harmony up until the end of 2018 within racing circles, and a commonness of purpose. That purpose saw an agreed approach to the distribution of prize money and to try and ensure that the middle and lower tiers were better supported. It saw a consistent approach to government to obtain the levy. It saw an approach to how we use our discretionary central funding around which areas we should invest in ownership growth, for example, in consumer growth, and so on, and of course equine welfare. But uncertainty over future media rights income is creating a bit of a division, but also, as I say, a burning platform for change. Right now, the industry's executive committee, which comprises representatives of the BHA, me, the horsemen, which is Charlie Liverton on behalf of the horsemen, and the racecourses, with David Armstrong for the Racecourse Association, together with my colleagues at the BHA, are working on an economic project so that there can be an agreed set of facts about the economic state of our industry as a whole that will draw upon the work done by the TBA, done by the Levy Board, done by a number of other sources to try and bring together a model that we can use that can help us make some strategic decisions for the sport. How important are field sizes versus number of fixtures? How much money should go in at the top end versus the bottom end? How many race courses will we support? How many horsemen will we support? At the moment, we have a culture where we try and support everything, except perhaps the breeders who have not had a huge amount of support from the central funding pot. At the moment, the BHA is asked to be the decision maker often on some of these areas, albeit it's in a position where if the horsemen and the racecourses agree on something, then the BHA's vote, if you like, doesn't count. And that's absolutely right. They are our members and shareholders, and where it's a more commercial matter or a policy matter for the sport on a strategic level, where there is agreement, that should lead the outcome. Albeit the BHA will want to ensure it's heard. But the reason I mention this is very often there isn't agreement between racecourses and horsemen, and a strong position is adopted by the racecourses, a strong position is adopted by the horsemen, and there's no agreed set of facts. And the BHA is left to try and make a decision in those circumstances. It's time to have that so that the sport can truly make a decision about its future based on fact and not rhetoric and the power of individual, self-interested, often, arguments. So just on that, I should say that the work's carrying on now up till October, and the leaders in the sport, including Julian at chair level, a number of the chairs across the tripartite organizations are coming together to work on strategy in parallel and to ask some of those questions and to make sure that we take a position on them and don't ignore them. And I'm very excited about the work, I have to say. And the TBA, through Julian and through Claire, have got a strong influence on the direction that will take. How do we work with the TBA? Well, government lobbying is a good example on Brexit, breeding and racing initiatives. Brexit's the best example. Julian has chaired an industry committee on this, which I think has done some tremendous work with a number of people I can see in the room, either on that committee or working on subcommittees to that group, planning for Brexit, working with the Irish and the French authorities, planning the way that we will go. Of course, we all want a managed exit. That will be best, but the group has met enough times not to suggest that we'll have no worries in the event of a no-deal Brexit, but at least we've started to think through the issues and we can be ready to mobilize in that particular situation. Obviously, I'll come on to that in a little while. Equine welfare is another area of key cooperation, and we were delighted that breeders accepted our challenge to register foals from the 30-day period. We're in year 2 of that now. That allows us to say to government and others that we've got visibility and traceability of racehorses or potential racehorses from beforehand. And I'm sure there will be much of a need to work together on welfare more in the future, and David will cover some more on that later. Race programs, we've heard this morning already, you'd like to see more. You'd like to see more effort put in around certain types of races. And again, strategically, that has to stack up for racing as a whole to make sure that it can secure the money. But I think there's a strong case. You know, with a stronger British breeding cohort and industry, then British racing has got to be in a better position. And we have to argue the case strongly amongst those who simply say that the money is for now in our sport. Breeding is 2, 3, 4 years lead time, obviously, and requires sustainable programs with commitment to them. Anti-doping, key that we work together on that, particularly in the early stages of development of horses. Genomics, we've announced a study over 3 years for £1 million, looking into the impact of that on the future of racing. We're particularly concerned with the narrowing of the gene pool and the impact that that might have on the soundness and the sturdiness of racehorses and what impact that might have on the future of British racing. And then finally, on economies and efficiencies, we look to work with the TBA. Mentioned Brexit. We have conducted, within that group, as I say, led very well by Julian, scenario planning, lobbying, consultation, and an industry strategy for Brexit, with key subcommittees, on areas such as tax, horse movement, the stud book, and so on. There has been strong industry collaboration. A number of people on that committee have given a huge amount of their time. DEFRA cooperation and planning has been absolutely first class, really, given where they are. And we've got strong contacts as a sport in that area, and that will continue whatever happens in Brexit. This is the review of buying and selling of racehorses and bloodstock in connection with British racing. I can't remember how many warnings I've had about this one. You must be mad, don't touch it, nothing will change, it's its own microsystem. What's the BHA doing involved with this, etc. Our board in 2017 said, what are the major risks for British racing and its reputation? And at the time, we had had some approaches from people within this sector of the industry and elsewhere, owners in particular, saying we're really concerned about practices in the buying and selling of race horses. The board accepted it as a risk, and we were tasked with conducting some work, which started in earnest in July 2018. We've involved some independent leads. Many of you will have met with Justin Felice or Chris Cerrone, who led the work for us, and I'm grateful to you for those of you who gave of your time. More than 60 people across the industry have been interviewed, breeders, bloodstock agents, sales houses, owners, trainers, industry bodies, and so on. And we've obtained opinions and evidence from each of them and developed them into key themes and recommendations. The report went to our board on the 3rd of July, and the board agreed with the direction of travel and has asked me to facilitate a session with industry leaders from the TBA, it's Ted Vout for the TBA, the FBA, sales houses, the NTF, the ROA, and some others, to a facilitated briefing and planning session in Newmarket on the 8th of August. Now, the leaders in those areas have had the recommendations, but they'll receive the recommendations again and the executive summary ahead of that meeting, and we will take them through the specific evidence at the meeting as well in a facilitated session. My hope is that leaders within the industry will accept the need for some change and will seek to cooperate with each other, most importantly, but also with the BHA facilitating it, such that the report can be issued with an agreed action plan. Some will say that's naive. Obviously, what the BHA can't do is pretend it hasn't done its report. And so one way or another, at some stage, the report will be made public, but we would like to do that with an agreed plan. We are concerned to ensure that small, medium, and large breeders have a fair run at the market, that owners who come to the market have a transparent approach and can understand what they're entering into, that people who work in the industry understand the consequences of taking certain types of action and the potential force of the law that may apply to them. And that's our motive for doing so. We want to ensure that the industry has a forward look. The last time the Industry Code of Practice was put in place was 2009. The BHA is an organization that can receive complaints. Under that, it has not received one since 2009. And given some of the evidence we've received, it would suggest that there needs to be some change in the market to help ensure that it works better, and I strongly believe, so that it'll make more money for the people involved in the industry over time. So we expect to publish a report in September, hopefully with an implementation plan agreed with leaders in the sport. And that's it. Have you any questions for me, please?
Hi, thank you. Tallulah Lewis. Nick, you mentioned that you're putting together a joint sort of facts and figures to agree an economic model. Who's the piece of work being undertaken by? Is it an independent body such as PwC? When will it be delivered? Who's it going to be distributed to? And is the betting industry involved in that strategic model?
It's being commissioned by the tripartite members of the BHA, effectively, as I mentioned, and will be managed at executive level, which means that all of our shareholder organisations, such as the TBA, will be involved in that process and will have access to it. The company involved is a company called Portus that is involved on the ownership project, which Charlie Liverton and the ROA are leading. They won a small pitch with other firms similar to the ones you mentioned. It wasn't PwC, but others involved. And they're starting work on the 5th of August. It'll be ready by November, we hope, ahead of an industry members meeting. We are liaising with the Racing and Betting Forum at the Levy Board over the data that they've been producing so that we can rely on that as well as part of the activity concerned. So the short answer is yes with regard to betting. This lady here.
Hi. I just wonder if you personally have got a vision for where you'd like racing to be in, say, 5 years' time.
Yeah, well, I had one when I came in, and it's still there. I believe this great sport, whenever it pulls together, is able to achieve anything that it wants. And there's so much good about it, but we don't realize it as a sport. And I think it needs some pruning, and we need to make some tough decisions and stop trying to support everyone. So on a personal basis, you know, I'd really like to see a fixture list and a fixture program and some innovation in the sport which marks our sport out as a sport that can compete with other sports in the modern age. And for me, that means not splitting the effort, for example, of horsemen on a busy Saturday in July between 4 premier meetings that happen to take place on the same day. You know, if the public wants to get involved in our sport, yes, they want to see the great horses. They also want to see the great horsemen. You know, they want to know where Frankie Dettori is likely to be riding. And that's pretty easy on some days, but not on some others. So the pattern for our sport that governs a heck of a lot of what we do in the traditions of the sport has been a great thing and continues to evolve. But the wider pattern for consumers, if you like, what is racing about? What can you expect? You know, I want to be able to have a centralized, frankly, not with the BHA before anyone starts criticizing us again, but I want to see a centralized strategic approach that says what we're all about. You know, we've done some research recently in connection with this Racing Futures project that I mentioned. 95% of the British public under the age of 30 have never seen a horse in the flesh, in real life. And one of the things that's gone down really well at the research is, gosh, could I get close to the horses then? Could I actually touch the horses? Oh, well, you can't touch them on a race day. No, we can't have that, no. But, you know, you go to York races, or sometimes at Newmarket, I think it's been done. We provide areas where people can go and actually touch them, experience them, feel them, get in touch with it. We need to do this together and stop marketing individual race days on their own. There is so much spent marketing individual race days, and God bless the race courses for doing it. But actually the sport needs to say, what is our top end? What is the story of our sport? And until we tackle that as a sport, which I'm hoping this economic work will help us to do, we're not going to get to anything like my vision for it. But I'd love to see a very clear narrative, and it's going to require some restructuring of the fixture list. You know, there was a lot of debate recently, the BHA's fudged it. The race courses wanted more fixtures or to stay the same for 2020. The horsemen wanted a reduction for a good reason as well. And the BHA's done a cut of 20 in the middle. Well, yeah, it wasn't a fudge, but I can see why people would think that. I want the economics to back up some bold moves for our sport so that our sport stands for something. So that the Frankel moments, the Bryony moments, the Golden Horn moments, the whatever it may be, the big moments in our sport are happening not just on a few days, but we can make those stories every week without dissolving our effort. And fundamentally, I think you know, we have to find a way in for the ordinary people to take part in our sport and get them engaged. At the moment, I feel that there's a very small engaged group and then a lot of people on the fringes. We have to get them involved. I could go on forever about premierization and all sorts of things, but given that Howard's behind you, Perhaps I can come and talk to you separately about what I see. The fact is, it's not my own remit for this. This is a tripartite thing. And whenever the BHA seeks to impose itself on the sport, we get pushed back a lot. Quite rightly, because it's a tripartite approach. But what I'm excited about now is I'll be able to say all that I want to say, and others will too, in a room with the data so that we can move this forward. You know, and it's great to have Julian in that room as well, because we've got someone who's got a bit of vision in the room.
Doug Proctor, Glanville Stud. Just about every slide up there has somewhere said horse welfare. And you just say horse welfare, it strikes me as very woolly. For example, how does you, knowing at 30 days what foals have been born on my stud, improve their welfare one iota?
It doesn't, unless we actually follow up and do checks at your stud and you accept them. And your leaders at the Thoroughbred Breeders Association were understandably cautious about extending regulation to breeders. I think breeding should be regulated, frankly, but it's not a major priority for us at the moment. But at least if we have issues where we find that horses subsequently have been doped in a particular way, which, you know, is not just about cheating, it's also about welfare, then we're able to go back, or we're able to check common related points which might link to your particular stud. The truth is we haven't got huge resources to spend on those areas, and we concentrate at the moment on what takes place in racing. But David will give you, I'm sure David will be a lot less woolly than I have been up here. In terms of what happens in racing, I can give you a million examples at the moment of what we're doing with trot-ups, medication checks, organising ourselves in a completely different way to manage risk, looking at individual race courses, looking at individual trainers and so on to look at their risk profiles. There's a lot going on in that space, and of course that's where we're going to focus first and foremost. Two reasons. One, because it's actually in our articles that that's what we're meant to be focusing on. And two, unfortunately, it's absolutely where government's looking at the moment. Thankfully, government isn't looking at the breeding sector at the moment, but I'm sure it'll come. I'm sure the public will focus on it at some point over the next few years.
Yes, a couple of questions, please, Nick. What are the chances of persuading the government to switch the levy from a gross profit basis to a turnover basis? And secondly, are the BHA taking any steps to make sure that these ownership schemes that advertising investment in horses don't transgress the CIS regs?
On the first one, I think limited chance. And the reason for that is simply that the whole of gambling legislation and regulation in this country is geared towards gross win. We would have to win a significant battle that I'm not sure is winnable in the near future with regards to saying go against all of the basis that you tax and regulate betting operators and change it for us only for turnover. And at the moment, DCMS is saying, well, hang on a minute, you've only had the new levy for 2 years. We can't see how it's settled down yet. You know, we might be persuaded on overseas racing, but in terms of a turnover basis, there isn't enough evidence yet. So I think if we do win on that basis, it's going to take some time. But we are continuing to show them the impact of the way in which betting operators are potentially gaming the system to try and make sure that they're persuaded. But I think it'll take some time. And the second one was around effectively managing particular schemes in connection with horse ownership, tax efficiency, and so on. We haven't got a team working on that, but coming out of the ownership work that Charlie is leading at the ROA, one of the key points we actually discussed this morning was, you know, the BHA would be delighted to help get involved in there. We just need some resources to look at it. So we're working hard on trying to free up the way in which syndicates and other forms of ownership can be set up, but at the same time we need to make sure that we manage risk and avoid people getting into difficulties.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.